Hey everybody, welcome back to Old Guys New Bikes. We pay attention to what you say, and we got a lot of comments about how much everybody loved the first episode, but you'd like to see us go a little deeper into some of the aspects of suspension. So you asked for it, you're going to get it. We're here today with Ron from ESR Suspension, and we're going to talk about forks first. So thanks for coming today, Ron. When it comes to forks, what are the problems, the symptoms, and how do you fix them? For example, head shake. Whenever I get head shake on a bike, it's pretty disconcerting.
Head shake can be a couple of things. It can be fork height, it can be compression and rebound.
Okay.
So you need to go over that, setting proper fork height.
So fork height is the amount of fork that's above the triple clamp, correct?
Correct.
And how much should you move it at a time?
Well, generally I like to start with what the OEM says as far as fork height, and then you have to get a feel if the bike is turning good for you, if it's got good traction and everything. So if you're not getting that, you need to maybe raise the forks 2 millimeters and then actually go the opposite direction, go 2 millimeters lower. So that'll give you a good indication of what you like.
And for those out there that are new to suspension testing, you can't go, hey, I don't like the way my bike turns, and then go back home, tweak it, go back to the track the next week, and expect it to be a fair comparison, because obviously track prep, weather, there's a whole bunch of things that affect traction and the way that your bike's going to handle. The best thing to do if you're going to work on your suspension is do everything in one day and identify what your problems are. And obviously you want to set the sag, and we're going to get to sag in a minute. But if the front end isn't biting and it's pushing in the turns, you're going to want to pull it up in the triple clamp a little bit. If it's head shaking, going down the fast straightaways, you might want to bring it down. And 2 millimeters is very, very slight measurement. So bring some calipers with you. Make sure that you're getting those both forks exactly the same, and make sure to take some notes, because you're going to forget. There's so many things going on here with compression, rebound, fork height, the rear end as well. You want to make sure to jot down so you know where you're at. But now we're on that's on fork height. What about compression, for example?
So compression, if the fork is feeling like it's spiky or just too firm,
Jolts off the jump.
Jolts,
yeah.
Slap downs on jumps and stuff like that, you need to soften the compression up a little bit.
Can you grab a fork and show us how that works? Now, this is an older Yamaha fork. They're actually opposite of what the new ones are, because the new ones, compression's on the top and rebounds on the bottom. So let's just do it as if it was a new fork. If you're turning that screw in, you're going to make the compression stiffer. If you're turning it out, you're going to make it less stiff. Correct?
Correct.
And then show them on the bottom where on a modern fork a rebound would be.
The rebound is down here. Typically it's a screwdriver adjustment.
Yeah, flat blade, very fine flat blade. Again, you want to write down what changes you've made, because you're going to forget. The other thing is, if you're going to check and see what your fork setting is to start with, don't turn it all the way in. Turn it all the way out and see how many clicks out you are. Figure out how many clicks there are total, because a lot of times when people crank it all the way in, they'll over tighten it and they'll actually bend the needle inside the fork.
Or they can get stuck.
Yeah, so best way is to click out and count the clicks until you get to the end. Know if there's 24 and you went out 12, you started at 12.
And a half a click doesn't count.
Half a click doesn't count.
Sometimes they'll go down and it's kind of like a half a click. That's not a click.
Yeah, that's what she said. But we want to make sure that you understand what you're doing when it comes to compression and rebound, and those two things have to balance. So the jolting and hard on your forearms feeling for the fork is too stiff on compression.
Correct.
And then what about if it's too soft on compression.
Too soft, it's going to bottom really easy. It can bottom like on a square edge bump, something really you wouldn't think it would bottom on.
And wallow around?
It's going to wallow around. The front end's not going to feel like it's got traction.
And then what about on the Rebound?
The Rebound, if it's too slow, it's going to give you a lot of head shake. And it's going to have terrible front end bite.
It's going to pack too,
It's going
right?
to pack, which causes head shake.
So packing is when it hits multiple bumps, usually coming into corners, and it doesn't have time to get back into its original position. So it just keeps getting shorter and shorter and shorter. The back end can do the same thing, but it's known as packing. So anybody that's not familiar with that term. And if you want to speed it up a little bit, you turn it out. So softening is always turning out, stiffening is always turning in. But now, Ron, during a day, when you have like soft conditions in the morning, and then later in the afternoon, some tracks get hard and square edged and all that stuff. What suspension change, what clicker change would you typically make on a fork?
So later on, I would probably lighten the Rebound a little bit if it becomes hard pack. And typically, if you lighten the Rebound, you may want to go in on compression a click or two.
Really?
Yeah.
And then what about if you are dealing with big ruts? Because, I mean, the ruts develop over the day, right? So if it gets ruddy and deep and whooped out, would you increase the compression?
Yes, absolutely. If it starts to get really deep and ruddy and there's big bumps, definitely you have to go in on the compression.
What about Rebound?
Rebound,
Not so much?
not so much.
So would you go 2 clicks?
On compression, yes.
Okay, so if it's a soft day and you're getting deep ruts with those big bumps going into them, you know, in between Moto 1 and Moto 2, you might want to go ahead and click that twice. You know, a Sharpie comes in pretty handy because when you go make those adjustments, you might forget by next week. Just write it on the top of the fork cap or on the triple clamp, anywhere that you'll remember, hey, I already went in 2 clicks because of the conditions on the day. What else about forks?
Keeping up on your maintenance.
Right.
Oil changes and stuff. Very critical.
Just because it's not leaking doesn't mean it doesn't need to be serviced, right? If anybody's taken apart an old fork that isn't leaking, that's been around for a long time, it's like mud inside. And that's not the way they're designed to work. So you want to make sure to keep up on the service. If you're riding on a regular basis, Ron, how often would you change the oil out?
20, 30 hours.
Well,
I wouldn't go more than 30 hours on oil.
Yeah, that might be 3 years for some guys, but
Some guys it's a month, some guys it's
right. At a minimum,
6 months.
At a minimum, if you are somewhere that you get snowbound in the winter, which I've lived in several times, that's a great time to take all your stuff apart and not only service your suspension, but re-grease all your linkage stuff, your head bearings, all the things that move will work much better once they're serviced. So if you're taking the winter off, that's the time to get that kind of stuff done. All right, we're going to talk about rear shocks. And if anybody is as old as I am, you know what that is. That's 1975 Yamaha YZ and MX rear shock. So this was the original single shock. Pretty medieval. Very small bladder, not unlike Ron, and works about as well. Little leakage as well, Ron. There's a lot of things that you have in common with this
Yeah.
one. Visual aids are very important in this job. So I spent the big money and bought us a KTM that we could use, because we're going to be talking about how the rear end of your bike works. We also have a Yamaha here that's all stripped down, ready for reassembly, and you can see the rear shock and how it attaches to the swing arm and the linkage. And there's a screw underneath on the shock that we're going to talk about here in just a second that's very important. But let's talk about the one main thing that most people don't realize is that when you sit on the bike and the back end comes down, that's called sag. And the difference between a few millimeters of sag will drastically change the way the motorcycle feels. You know, one of the great things about new bikes is there's a lot of adjustment to them. One of the bad things about it is there are a whole bunch of ways to screw it up. And if you haven't set the sag on your bike to manufacturer's spec and then dial it in for you from there, then your bike's never going to handle the way it was designed. And if you change weight, whether you go from one rider to another, or you stop by Krispy Kreme on the way to the track, your sag's going to change. Okay, that's why we'll show you the Slacker machine over here that can digitally show you what your sag is. Good investment. So anyway, when you sit on the bike, the back end goes down. It needs to be set at manufacturer spec to start with. Now, Ron, we've got compression, we've got rebound, we've got spring rate on the rear shock. We also have high speed and low speed. And some of the folks on the first video wanted to know what the heck that means. On our modern Yamaha, we have it. On the old Yamaha, we don't. Want to go ahead and talk about that?
On the modern bike, the center adjustment is the screw, and that's your low speed adjustment.
Low speed compression.
Low speed compression. On this bike, particular 14 millimeter, like T-handle, this is going to be your high speed adjustment.
And turning in to the right on any of the suspension adjustment makes it stiffer, right?
Yeah, think of it as you tighten it, it's going to get stiffer.
Okay, so show us with my visual aid that I spent a lot of money on.
People get confused with high speed, low speed. So as you're riding along, basically this is kind of like a low speed situation. And where high speed comes into play is like if you're riding along and then you hit a square edge hole, and that's that right there. That would be high speed situation. So
if you have a track that has a lot of pocketed holes that you're hitting down straightaways and that kind of stuff, how much on that high speed adjuster, which is the outside nut, how much do you turn it?
Typically you want to go like quarter turn increments.
Okay, so we're not talking clickers like the center.
No, unfortunately most manufacturers on the high speed, they do not have clicks. It's basically turns.
Okay.
So it's easy to get lost with that.
But don't go any more than a quarter.
Quarter turn is rule of thumb, basically.
Okay. And then how's that going to change the way the bike reacts?
So it's going to make the bike sit up a little more, and it can make the bike a little firmer on things. But in some instances, it can make the bike plusher because the bike stays higher in the stroke when you hit stuff.
So it's not blowing through the stroke.
It's
when you
not
hit
blowing
that
through the
high
stroke.
Edge,
Yeah.
Or that high speed hole in the track, right?
Yeah, because you can have a bike, for instance, where it's riding really good, but then when you hit a square edge bump, it'll actually bottom on something kind of small sometimes.
And kick the back end.
And kick the back end up.
Okay. And then what about rebound?
Rebound is down here typically, and that causes a lot of problems with people. A lot of people like to run rebound too tight because they don't want to kick on jumps. But you can get lost in rebound and have bad packing issues and think that the bike is too stiff. So,
yeah, again, that's on the bottom of the shock. You're gonna have to get on the ground with the screwdriver. But again, if you're gonna go out and spend a day dialing in your bike on suspension, take a Sharpie, take a legal pad, make notes, because you're gonna have a lot of things going on. You got sag, you got high speed, low speed, compression. One thing that we didn't talk about was spring rate. How do you know that the spring rate that you have on your bike, especially if you bought one from somebody else, right? How do you know it's right for you?
there's a number of ways. You have to set your sag, then you have to measure the free sag, you have to measure the set length of the sag and how much preload you have.
Okay, so for people in the simple world, if you crank your spring all the way off and you sit on it and you can't get the correct, let's say 100 millimeter sag, spring's too stiff, right?
Correct.
And the same thing goes for the front. You're going to get a certain amount of sag on the front when you sit on the bike.
Correct.
And so if you bought some bike from somebody that weighs 50 to 75 pounds more than you do, it more than likely has stiff springs on it. So you're going to be chasing your tail trying to make your bike work the way it's designed if it doesn't have the right springs. So my rule of thumb is if I buy something from somebody, I always take the shocks and or the shock and the forks off, put new springs in it, and then change fluid. I like to start and know what I have going forward as opposed to hoping that it's right. Is there any other tips on the whole shock issue that you think is important?
Sag is really a big thing.
Yeah.
Getting the sag
Huge
correct.
thing.
Correct.
Yep, and it can change during the day as well, right?
Especially on a brand new bike, you need to ride it and check it. It can go from, say, if you set your sag at 100, by the middle part of the day it can be 105 because everything's loosened up.
Well, the springs break in, right?
Everything does seat in, yes.
Yeah, so a spring is going to get softer and broken in as you put time and hours on the bike. So make sure if it's a new bike, you go through that process. If it's a new bike, you should have a manual. If you're buying a used bike from somebody, get a manual so you're not chasing your tail. But if you want to make sure that what you have is right for you, take the forks and the shock off, have them serviced, make sure that the spring rates are correct for you, and get a baseline and start from there, right?
So we got the slack adjuster here. This is the best way, and I feel the most accurate way to check your sag. It's a digital system.
Magnetic, very easy to install. And then you zero it out, and now you know what the free length is. So as you told me before, you got to make sure not to bump that thing, because then the setting's going to be off, right?
It can move a couple of millimeters. So you do always want to make sure that when you take the bike down off the stand, whether it's on this or an automatic one, do it very carefully so it doesn't move.
Can we take it off carefully? You ready?
Yeah.
All right.
So what you're looking at is the free sag. Now the bike's sitting on the ground, and we have a pretty good number, the 35 millimeters free sag.
And the manufacturers build bikes for a range of riders and weights. And I would imagine the average guy is going to be 175 pounds right in there.
Typically.
Yeah, riding moto. So, all right, let's see how it is with me on the bike.
Now there's a couple of ways of doing this. I tend to feel that standing is the best way because usually the rider's more centered over the bike. Sitting down, you can get 2 or 3 different measurements, but some guys like to do that.
Where are we at?
We're at 103.
Which is,
So this is pretty close for this bike. I believe most people like this bike at 100 millimeters. But sometimes that's rider preference. People are going to like 98. Some people are going to like 100. But at least you know you're in the ballpark right now.
and if you wanted to go to 100 from 103, again, you're tightening. So you're going to loosen your lock nut. You're going to turn the spring to the right to tighten it and then recheck it. You don't have to go a long ways for 3 millimeters, maybe 1 revolution to do it. But that's how you end up, and you're going to have to start the process over again. And it's really tough when you're doing it with a measuring tape. So the slacker is our go-to when we're doing this. Plus we're old, we can't remember stuff. So, all right, we're going to wrap it up with talking about various different conditions. So out here on the West Coast, we get a lot of hard pack stuff, square edge holes, high speed. What would you do in that situation in a general sense for suspension, front and rear?
So for dry, hard pack, square edge situations, personally, I run as little as high speed compression on the shock as I can get away with. Because dry, hard pack situations, you're looking for as much traction as you can get. So rebound is very critical, and high speed, like I said, run as little as you can get away with. So
What about on the fork?
on the forks, it's not going to change too much. You'd probably end up playing around with the rebound a click faster or two, just to get that traction is what you're looking for.
That front end traction?
Yeah.
Okay, and then let's say for the guys on the East Coast that are, riding in soft dirt and ruts and deep bumps.
Well, they can get away with a lot more in softer dirt, a lot more compression, front and rear. But as far as like woods and stuff, I'm sure they focus more on like how the bike turns.
Yeah, but in woods and desert, so you got East Coast, West Coast again. Woods and desert, it's softened up so it doesn't deflect on rocks and.
Correct. It's very similar. The speeds are higher in the desert, but in reality, there's just as many rocks back east as there out here.
Right.
Roots and stuff like that. So.
But your moto bike isn't set up to ride desert or woods. And
Not
your
at all.
woods bike isn't gonna. I rode my Yamaha WR at Glen Helen, and it was mush.
Right.
It's perfect in the desert.
Right.
But it was mush on a moto track.
It's two different animals.
Yeah. So know what you're working with, and don't try and get one suspension to fit everything, because it won't. It might just put you on your head. If there are any other questions that you guys have about suspension, chassis, or what you'd like to see next from Old Guys New Bikes, put it in the comments. We'll pay attention to them. Thanks again, and we will see you soon.